Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and we are in a bye week here in Happy Valley. It doesn't mean it's an off week for us by any means. We've got the coaching search thread going full throttle over at lions247.com. We all survived the great AWS outage of October 2025. We are back up and running. We're over 1.2 million views on that thread, more than 13,000. I think we're approaching 14,000 total comments. So everyone is welcome to join that discussion. And if you're not yet a VIP, we can become one for 60% off. I'm told that deal ends Tuesday at midnight. This episode drops on Tuesday. Perhaps it'll be extended, but I can't promise that. So I encourage you, if you want to be part of this coaching process, we have some great board insiders. We have our staff working hard to bring you our reporting. We've reached out to guys on campuses all over the country as well. We've got a pretty good network to tap into along the way here. So a lot going on that. We're going to get that conversation to this episode by bringing in Chris Hummer, national analyst with the 247 Sports Network and also with CBS Sports. I've known Chris for a long time. If you followed his coverage or our national coverage at the 247 or CBS level, you're well aware of his presence when it comes to these coaching searches and just the big picture stuff across college football that sometimes we can't take a moment to exhale and appreciate because we're so locked into our game to game weeks here. Taking a little bit of a break from that. We will be back on the practice field on Tuesday evening, actually, a day ahead of our normal look at practice. It'll be our first look at Penn State practice since James Franklin was fired. We were not able to get in the field last week. They had a bit of a different schedule because of that firing and what it led to, changing some things from the practice standpoint. But we will let you know what we see. There's some injuries that we're monitoring, certainly some personnel plans that we're anticipating could evolve a bit without James Franklin in the mix and with this team riding a 4-game losing streak. So check out our coverage. We'll have an offensive, defensive notebook. We'll have photo gallery and everything else you expect from our practice coverage at Lions 24/7. We will also hear from, for the first time since preseason camp, offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki on Wednesday afternoon. So obviously there's a lot to catch up on from August with Penn State's offensive play caller. Not much of it great. Not going to be a very comfortable, fun conversation with Andy, but we all have a job to do, including him, and that discussion will be had on Wednesday. So we'll have a ton of feedback for you at lions247.com. Later this week with our second episode, we're going to stick to 2 episodes during this bye week. We'll get Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen back on board to share their perspective from our visit to the Penn State practice facilities. We'll look back a little bit at what went down in Kinnick Stadium on Saturday night, what we saw that was different and the same for Penn State post James Franklin firing. But as I mentioned, we're going to hop onto the coaching carousel right now with Chris Hummer. Chris, always good to hear from you. Good to get you on. And more pressing than ever, we need some clarity on a few things. I don't know how much you can give us in this moment, but Penn State made a big move a couple Sundays ago in firing James Franklin. Obviously, it's been well reported and well discussed. And last week it was kind of front and center on ESPN Game Day with James Franklin making his return to the public eye. Everyone seems to have an opinion on this situation. We've certainly given ours over the course of the last 10 days or so on this podcast. But before we get going with what happens next, why don't you take a look back for us, what you were maybe hearing about James Franklin leading up to that firing, and ultimately your reaction to the timing of Pat Kraft's decision.
Well, first, man, 14,000 comments on your message board with that coaching search. I haven't really been over there in a week or two. I did not realize it was that high. That is crazy.
It's been a wild ride.
Great job.
Thank you.
But the James Franklin thing, it came as a surprise. It came as a surprise to sources around the country. I remember being on a phone with an agent when that was happening. He called me saying that he heard something was imminent at Penn State. And we were only talking for a minute or two. We were probably a coordinator, right? Because even during that conversation, we didn't think it'd be James Franklin. And then the news broke before I even had a chance to call and check on anything that James Franklin was out. And it's still one of the more surprising firings of this century in college football. James Franklin was incredibly successful in Happy Valley, and I understand the 3-3 start not being acceptable, but he won a lot of games, and this is a coaching cycle where I don't think there's a ton of slam dunk candidates, and Penn State's going to have to swing really hard in order to get somebody that has better qualifications than James Franklin. So that's what makes it so interesting to me. And yeah, I mean, it really did come as a surprise, and it's still weird all these years later. I think James Franklin was the 12th longest tenured head coach in the FBS. James Franklin not being the head coach of Penn State just kind of feels odd, but college football never slows down for anyone, including somebody who's won as much as James Franklin.
I've talked about it before. This is my 9th season covering Penn State, and no matter the ebbs and flows of how the team's doing, the ebbs and flows of how my life is going, James Franklin's been in the background. He's been the guy running the show here for Penn State football, and to see him removed last week, I think we're all still trying to settle into that reality, and it's been surreal. I think James Franklin called it surreal on the game day set on Saturday. I think most people here would agree, especially who have been covering this team for a while. The guy who made that decision and the guy who was tasked with taking that big swing, Chris, is athletic director Pat Kraft. He told us in the press conference a day after firing James Franklin that this is a decision that wasn't necessarily just based on a 3-game sample size. It sounded like he was very much going to be evaluating James Franklin, trying to figure out where the trajectory of this program was going to be as this season worked through. He made the decision. He said the goal is to hire someone who can take this team to national championship games. They haven't done that since the 1986 season. They were very close last year. What do you think about this move for the athletic director, and how much pressure does he now face locally, but really nationally, big picture, to get this one right?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Did he hire Scott Halfley at Boston College, Pat Kraft?
Yes.
Or did he get there right after? He did?
I believe so.
Yeah, so he's hired 2 football head coaches basically his entire run as an athletic director. You go back to Matt Rhule at Temple, and then Pat Kraft, and then Jeff Halfley. So, I mean, it's a huge moment for him. Like, you're really swinging when you fire probably one of the most successful head coaches in Penn State history. Obviously, like, Joe Paterno is on a different tier than everybody else, but like in this modern time when James Franklin really helps lift the program out of ignominy, like, you're parting ways with the guy who did a lot for Penn State football, and you better get it right, because there's no guarantee you get somebody better coming out of this. So there's a ton of pressure on him, and it's just going to be a really, really interesting cycle. Obviously, Pat Kraft has some very obvious relationships that I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, but yeah, this is a scenario where people in the industry kind of raise their eyebrows at it. A lot of people have told me there's no guarantee they end up getting better. They could. So there's a ton of pressure on Pat Kraft in this environment to get this right. And man, like, I don't know what y'all have heard, but like, sometimes a working relationship factors in to decision makers make. And James Franklin, at least according to the people I talked to, isn't always the easiest person to deal with on the back end. He asked for a lot. He demanded a lot. And I can understand the reaction from Pat Kraft when you gave him everything possible this year. There's no question Penn State had everything you need. New receivers, not a new offensive coordinator, highest paid defensive coordinator in college football, all the money for these guys to get back and avoid the NFL. Like, I understand the reaction, but you really have to get it right when you make a move like that.
I think in best case scenario, obviously you get your Kirby Smart to your Mark Richt, but boy, is that far from a guarantee in any kind of move like this. So
a lot of people have looked for their Kirby Smart from Mark Richt over the years and been very disappointed by the next hire. So, but you can get it right. Like, you really can. Like, it happens, but Kirby Smart and Mark Richt is basically the only real example I can think of that of the last like 20 or 30 years, to be frank. So it can happen, but it's not a guarantee.
When you look at this job opening from a national perspective, and I know that's how you look at everything, and that's why we love to get you in here, because we're so fixated on what's happening here in Happy Valley. But when you're talking to people in the agency world and you're talking to people across the industry, the Florida job just came open, but there seems to be some real question marks about that university's leadership and what that structure and dynamic will look like moving forward. How is Penn State situated in terms of a desirable location for a coach to kind of stake claim to for the next few years at least?
I think it's the first or second best job, and I think it just depends on your priorities. I was actually talking with a defensive coordinator about this last night at school, and we were just debating which was the better job. And we kind of came to this conclusion. If you're looking for a national championship ceiling, the place you can win multiple titles and consistently be in the mix, it's Florida, at least in my opinion. The better recruiting base, slightly higher ceiling. They've done it multiple times in this century. Like, you've seen that blueprint, but the pressure is much bigger. The expectations are more difficult. The schedule is more difficult to navigate. That job can go very wrong, as we've seen in recent years. Plus, like, to be frank, like, Florida's roster right now with the right coach, I think is situated to win next year. Like, this is a team that could make the playoff if somebody holds on to guys like DJ Lagway and Dallas Wilson. Penn State, I think, is in a slightly different situation. If I'm a head coach looking for stability and a place with a pretty high floor and a ceiling where you can reach the national championship game if things go well, like that's a very attractive job. Like Penn State historically has very little coaching turnover. What is it, like 5 head coaches since like 1950, basically?
Yeah.
So that's a place you can go for a long time and be successful. It's a place you can build. It's a place where patience is a feature. I know the Penn State fan base has been very frustrated with James Franklin, but I mean, I encourage everybody to go wade into a Florida message board on a Saturday and kind of see what that's like. It's a special thing. And Penn State is a really good job in that way. I would think the recruiting ceiling is a little lower, like geographically. Historically, Penn State does not sign a lot of top 10 classes. I think the money is going to be there moving forward. At least that's the idea now. But there were times the last couple of years where Penn State lagged behind the Ohio States and the Michigans in terms of resources. Florida does not have that problem. They're going to spend what they need to, or at least they are now. They were behind an NIL as well, but I don't think that's a question for them moving forward. So I think it's kind of just like what you're looking for in a head coach. I would probably pick Florida. I'm sorry to say that on a Penn State thing on a show. Like if I'm looking to win a national championship, I think I think you have a slightly higher chance of doing that at Florida than you do at Penn State. But if I'm a coach looking for stability, if I'm a coach looking to build, I am choosing Penn State 10 out of 10 times. It has a lot of attractive qualities when you compare it to Florida, but I think it's just a matter of preference.
The other thing that, of course, is so different now with hiring a new coach than it was 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, is that you're not counting on getting 3 recruiting cycles underneath your roof to build off of. You can make some pretty drastic moves to impact your 2 deep, your starting lineup via the transfer portal, via NIL opportunities. We have heard that the NIL situation is going to be very good for Penn State here moving forward. And say what you will about this decision, but it seems like some people are stepping up financially because they see this as maybe a pivot point for the program. They see it as a way to maybe assert their influence on the program here in this moment. So it sounds like Pat Kraft is going to have some deeper pockets maybe to work off of. How much is that in play for a school like Penn State right now in this moment where maybe you don't have to take a step back for a couple of years? Everyone sees what Indiana has done, Indiana of all schools in the last couple of years. Is this a situation where because of the climate in college football, you could really fill some holes in a hurry and get yourself back into contention versus maybe having to do a reset/rebuild for multiple years?
Yeah, absolutely. That is the avenue that NIL and the portal provides. I do, and this is like, I obviously cover the transfer portal pretty closely for 247. I do wonder in this era how much top end talent we see move. I think rev share makes it easier than ever for people to re-sign their best players. I don't think a single first team all conference player from the Power 4 moved last year in the winter transfer portal cycle, and just one total moved period. That was AJ Halsey going from Houston to LSU. So the best players in each conference don't tend to move a lot because teams place an emphasis on retention. And I think that will, in a way, affect a team's ability to reload on the fly. And it's not like, I'm not talking about like an Iowa State. I'm not talking about like a Cincinnati reloading on the fly where the level of competition is a little lower in the Big 12 than it is in the Big 10. But in terms of building a championship contender from day one at a Penn State, I think that's more difficult than even it was a year or two ago, especially when you consider all the pieces that will be leaving this roster. Mm-hmm. But like Penn State can certainly be competitive if you bring the right coach, get the right quarterback, and make 20 or so smart transfer portal additions. Win a national championship, not sure about that from the jump. I think that's going to require infrastructure and recruiting and development. But you can absolutely be competitive right away, in my opinion.
I've got some names I want to throw your way, but first I want to hear from you when you're talking with people about this Penn State job. Who are the names that have been consistently coming up? Are there any maybe here in week 2 of the coaching search that are coming up a little bit more often than they were in week 1?
It's still Matt Rhule and then everybody else when I talk to people.
You're going to get people fired up, man.
Yeah, it's just like, it is what it is, man. Like he lost, but I don't really think that affects how people feel about this job. I was told Kurt Signetti, they were going to make a really strong run at him. That obviously got shut down right away. And Matt Rhule were the two names that you needed to know going into this. And one of them's off the table, and the other one's a Penn State alum that has a really close relationship with the AD, and I know has always desired the job. Is that enough for Penn State to be willing to hire him? I don't know. I mean, he hasn't won a top 25 game since his time at Temple. Like, I can see why people would be hesitant. But Matt Rhule's a really good football coach. He's really well liked in the industry. I think he does a really good job, and that's the name that everybody points to. Like, there are other names, and I'm sure we'll get to them, but it's Matt Rhule, and then it's everyone else when you talk about this job, when you talk to agents, when you talk to people in the industry about it. He's the one that always comes up first.
And so that 18-point loss Friday night to Minnesota obviously sent people in a very definitive direction how they feel about him. He's got to come here to Penn State. We'll get to see Matt Rhule lead the Cornhuskers into Beaver Stadium in November. But there's also a thought process here where does it get to a point where if the second half of the season goes so rough for the Cornhuskers, where they go from 5-1 to maybe 7 wins, who knows, 6 wins, depending on how it goes out the rest of these next couple of months. Does it get to a point where regardless of those connections, regardless of his desire, regardless of their relationship with Pat Kraft, where, again, with the amount of pressure on Pat Kraft in this moment, it would be too hard of a sell in your mind? Or does Pat Kraft set that aside, not be a prisoner of the moment, and if this is what he sees as the best fit, he just finds a way to get it, to make it happen regardless of how the community might react?
Well, I mean, every administration's different, and how much power every AD is very different. Pat Kraft, based on the way the James Franklin situation played out, seems to have a lot of influence at Penn State and a lot of say over things. Not to say that money wasn't upset at Penn State after the loss to UCLA and Northwestern, but 7-5 is a tough sell. But like, as an AD, you have to have conviction in the people you hire, and if he believes Matt Rhule's the right guy, like, I think he'll still go forward with it. Do I know if he'll believe Matt Rhule's the right guy if they get to 7-5? I don't. Like, it's hard to forecast hypotheticals when we don't know it'll play out. I would still bet Nebraska finishes with 8 or 9 wins based on the schedule, but it sounds bad. Like, it's not really good podcast material, but I think it's really just a we'll see with Matt Rhule, because the only person that really knows is Pat Kraft. People talk to Pat Kraft, and ADs are very smart about how they sprinkle information in during these searches. The misinformation is spread very easily. But if I'm Pat Kraft and I've believed in Matt Rhule for this long, I would personally not be dissuaded by the guy finishing 8-4. If he's my guy, he's my guy, but we'll see if that's the case.
Now, it feels like this is a fluid situation because all these coaching searches are, but it does seem like the guy who has the staying power, that whenever, if we get into mid to late November, his name's still going to be there, is Matt Rhule. A few of the names I want to throw your way are out of the SEC. And based on the conversations that I've had with some people and some things that we've observed here locally, and then checking in with people on their campuses in the SEC, is Penn State's almost hoping that these coaches don't do enough to make the playoff, and then they're in a spot where it may be a little easier to pry them away. Maybe the program that they're currently with would be a little less willing to do everything to keep them. The big name that we've heard, in my opinion, the biggest, is Kalen DeBoer, that Penn State would love to get involved with. I've heard there's maybe a bit of a culture clash thus far in Tuscaloosa, but the wins will win everybody over. And they've won 4 consecutive games against top 25 teams. They've got 1 loss on the season. Another, Eli Drinkwitz, his only loss on the season so far is to Alabama. And then the last one I wanted to bring up here is Mike Elko down at Texas A&M. He's 7-0 on the season. They've got a top 5 ranking. We know that Texas A&M has deep pockets around that program. Out of those 3 names, do any of them seem more realistic to you? And how much is that in play, the way the rest of this year may go for a guy like DeBoer, a guy like Elko? Because it's hard to see if they get to the finish line of the regular season and they've punched their ticket for a playoff, that they're going to remove themselves from a situation where they have support, where they have their players in place, and where they've been able to stack up some wins this season.
Well, I think Drinkwitz is the most realistic. I think there's a certain ceiling you hit at Missouri compared to the rest of some of the top tier jobs in the country. And I fully expect Drinkwitz to be a name that's brought up frequently with Florida as well. I think you're going to see him connected to both of these jobs pretty heavily. And I think that's totally understandable given the job he's done. Obviously, I'm sure Penn State fans have been watching very closely how he's handled Bo Perbiglia this season. And he's a really good coach who did a really nice job activating NIL and Missouri. I think Missouri does as good of a job as anybody in the country in terms of paying their players and finding creative solutions to make the roster better. So you got to give Drinkwitz a lot of credit there. And I think he is a coach that I'm not saying he's going to leave Missouri, but I think other jobs could tempt him to at least consider them. DeBoer, I'd be surprised, but we also don't know how the next 5 weeks are going to go. I think we all thought Mike Norvell was pretty safe 4 weeks ago, and he's lost 4 straight. And despite the vote of confidence over the weekend, I don't think he'll be safe at season's end necessarily. And if things go south for Kalen DeBoer at the end of the year, and you look at 2 straight losing season or 2 straight disappointing seasons, and the Alabama fan base turning on you, maybe you give Penn State more consideration than you do before. But I think Alabama is one of the 4 best jobs in college football, and if you want to win national championships, I have a hard time seeing him leave there. Mike Elko is interesting. We could probably debate Texas A&M versus Penn State. I think it's a worthy one. He's obviously very familiar with that area of the country. I think he's as good of a coach as anybody in the country. I think that was one of the best hires of the last 10 years to bring Mike Elko to Penn State, or to bring Mike Elko to Texas A&M. And if Penn State can get him to listen, that would be an awesome hire. I don't know if he will. I haven't really asked anybody around Elko the last couple of days about that specifically, but if you can make it work, if you're Penn State, that's a home run if you can get him to listen to it.
Another name that's been brought up on our boards a bit by some other people in this industry is Matt Campbell. And I know that his name gets tossed around a lot and a lot of people have respect for what he's done at Iowa State. And I think many people are surprised that he's still doing it at Iowa State because there have been opportunities for him to move on. Some higher profile jobs that have kind of surfaced. I'm personally think that Wisconsin job, if that were to open up, could be a great fit for him. But what do you make of Matt Campbell? Because some people will tell you he's the most underrated coach in college football. Some people will tell you he's to the point where he's overrated now. What is the value you see in him as a coaching candidate? And do you see a potential fit for Penn State with Campbell?
I think Matt Campbell's an incredible coach. I think Matt Campbell and James Franklin are very similar in that they are floor raisers. Unlike James Franklin, who we've seen in a situation where the ceiling can be raised, right? Like you have a ceiling that's up here. We've never seen Matt Campbell in a similar situation. Iowa State has its limitations, always will have its limitations, but Matt Campbell turned around a broken program there, and he turned it into a pretty consistent winner. So I think he's an incredible coach. People in the industry, sources I talk to all the time, have always said Matt Campbell wants one of the big Midwest jobs. Usually that's a Michigan, Notre Dame, Ohio State in terms of kind of those 3, but Penn State's right there, even though Penn State's not quite the Midwest the way those other 3 jobs are. Although Pennsylvania is a very long state, and I guess on the Western side, maybe it fits a little bit more in that bucket. But I think he's a really good coach. Do I know if he's an upgrade over James Franklin? I don't, but I don't think it would be a bad hire for Penn State whatsoever if it got there. I just don't know if. It's funny how these searches work. We talk about the brightness of somebody's star, the quality of their coaching. And I always hear people say, I'm not sure like if Matt Campbell's going to do enough this year to get consideration for that job. But I mean, this is a guy who won 11 games last year, is going to have probably 8 or 9 wins this year. Like that's a really good season, but that is something that comes up all the time in these coaching searches, which always cracks me up. But I do feel that way. We're talking about Matt Rhule in that way. And if Matt Campbell doesn't win 9 games this year, I don't know how palatable that would be to Penn State fans.
Well, when you look at the Big Ten structure right now, 2 of the big dogs, Oregon and Ohio State, they made coaching hires, head coaches that hadn't been head coaches before. And so I want to throw that your way. A few names who are coordinators right now: Brian Hartline, Will Stein at Oregon, Hartline, of course, at Ohio State, and then Joe Brady up with the Buffalo Bills. We've heard some things about him as well along the way with this process. One, what does the risk reward look like to you for Penn State coming off of having a program builder like James Franklin to the exit door and then bringing in somebody who hasn't really had that experience yet? And among those names I just threw your way, it's been a while since Brady did it in college football, but when he did it, he was the Broyles Award winner. Who is the more intriguing of those 3 names of non-head coaches?
Well, Hartline, of those 3, Hartline is the one that I hear frequently with the Penn State job, at least on my end. He's come up a lot, which is interesting. And I think your point's a salient one when you think about like the 4 best head coaches in college football right now, right? That's probably Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, Dabo Sweeney. I know that stock is down, and I'm going to throw Lincoln Riley in this bucket, even though it's not quite on the same level. Like all 4 of those guys were assistants when they were hired for their full-time job. Many of them were already in the building, which I think makes a difference. But in Kirby Smart's case, like the best head coach in the sport, like Georgia took a risk on a defensive coordinator, and Dan Lanning as well. I should throw him in there. That was a defensive coordinator hired by Oregon. So if you have the belief in that coordinator that they're going to be that level of head coach, like I think that's a more than justifiable thing for Penn State to do. I do think it's a really risky thing for Penn State to do following James Franklin, but if you have that conviction, like I get it. I don't know if Brian Hartline, who has only been a play caller for 1 or 2 years, he essentially had those duties stripped from him once, and now he's the play caller again. Will Stein is really intriguing, has no real connections to the Pennsylvania area, but is obviously doing a great job at Oregon. And I'm sorry, who was the other coordinator you mentioned?
Joe Brady, who's now the Buffalo Bills offensive coordinator. We know what he did with LSU in that historic offense with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson back in 19. But he also, kind of got his coaching career moving a little bit by being a GA here in 2015, 2016, worked under Moorhead during the 2016 Big Ten championship run for Penn State, got a master's degree here from the university. So he wouldn't be walking into unfamiliar terrain. And there's also the thing here that I have to make sure you're aware of. Terry Pegula, the owner of the Buffalo Bills, is also one of the major players in the Penn State athletics scene. The hockey arena is named after him. There's been a lot of interest in getting him more involved with the football program, and more supportive perhaps. And there's, as far as I've gathered, Terry Pegula isn't exactly saying stay away from my offensive coordinator. It's been more of, why don't you take a look at my offensive coordinator based on what we've heard thus far.
Yeah, that's fast. I mean, that's fascinating. Joe Brady, and somebody mentioned him, but he's not somebody that comes up frequently in these things, but that makes a ton of sense. And Joe Brady's somebody that people have tried to pry away from Buffalo for a couple of years now for both offensive coordinator and head coaching roles. If you can get Joe Brady, I think that's the hire. I think that's a hire that would really excite a fan base. We've seen the way he's developed quarterbacks going back to Joe Burrow, his time with Josh Allen in Buffalo. This is somebody very well respected. Ironically, was Matt Rhule's offensive coordinator for a very brief time in Carolina. So there's that connection there as well. So that would be a very interesting hire. I think of those 3, Joe Brady's the most proven. He hasn't been in college in a minute, so I think that affects things. He hasn't been in college during the NIL era either. So that is another thing to consider. Like college has changed a lot since he was on that 2019 national championship with LSU. But yeah, that's a very intriguing hire, especially with his history with Penn State. I would be very interested in that one if I was a Penn State fan.
I wanted to segue to my final point off of what you just brought up, the way you got to build a roster right now. And for a guy like Joe Brady coming in from an NFL offensive coordinator job or someone who hasn't had that head coaching experience, the talk around town here is that there needs to be a prioritization of a general manager type role here. And there needs to be someone who's basically working hand in hand with the head coach, doing their own thing so the head coach can focus on more football, more X's and O's perhaps, than trying to figure out who to pay, how much to pay them, which positions to load up on, which positions that you can maybe skip on a little bit more. And so when you kind of assess the college football landscape right now, we've seen these general manager roles pop up. How important have they become? And when you look at Penn State moving forward, is that something that they need to embrace here?
Well, I mean, to be fair, like Andy Frank does a lot for Penn State in that capacity now, like as GM. So I think every head coach is going to handle that differently. There are very few true GMs in college athletics right now that handle the cap, dictate roster management, and everything else. So you would have to have the right type of head coach that would be willing to embrace that model, because inherently when you hire a GM with that much power, you take power away from the head coach, and not all head coaches are going to be willing to cede that. But that GM position is very important. You need somebody to manage the cap. You need somebody who evaluates well. You need a buffer between the head coach and the coaches and negotiating. It is not healthy when a head coach is directly negotiating with its players. That can only cause tension. So yeah, all those things are very critical, but I don't know if we'll see an NFL style GM at Penn State, nor do I think that's necessarily necessary in this era, at least as of yet. So that'll be interesting. But from my point of view, like Penn State, when you ask people about the most respected GMs in college football right now, like Andy Frank was always pretty close to the top of that list.
It's hard for me to also see Andy Frank being here much longer. And all due respect to the job he's done here.
Oh,
I
don't disagree with that. I was just saying, like, it's not like Penn State hasn't had that presence before. Yeah, I would be very surprised if Andy Frank was not wherever James Franklin goes next. I would be very surprised if Andy Frank wasn't there with him. But like,
pretty easy to connect that dot.
Yeah, Penn State. When people, at least from a development and evaluation standpoint, the last decade, when people thought about the 3 or 4 best teams in the country at doing that, Penn State always came up.
I wanted to ask you about James Franklin because it doesn't sound like he wants to go sit on a beach for a year by any means. So when you kind of look at his landscape moving forward, what are some schools that stand out to you? I know there's more job openings to come up. Is it a school that's already got a job opening? Is it a school that could have a job opening? And where do you see him ultimately in the grand scheme of things in this coaching carousel as someone who is valued by athletic directors and by university presidents?
I think everybody but Florida and Penn State would be crazy not to at least gauge James Franklin's interest. I had a pretty well-connected source kind of in the coaching landscape, agent landscape and what have you, say there's no question that James Franklin's a top 10 coach in the sport. So I think it would be a benefit to almost all schools to consider him. I don't know if Florida will, to be honest. But if a Florida State came open, like I think they'd be crazy not to. It'll be interesting to see what happens with a couple of places. I think Virginia Tech is a natural fit for James Franklin's background. But let's say a Maryland potentially could come open, depending on how things go with Mike Locksley down the stretch. Obviously, James Franklin was the coach in waiting there at one point in time. It would take some pride being swallowed on one end of that to make that happen. And then like South Carolina is an interesting one. To be honest, there's a lot of rumors out there about Shane Beamer and Virginia Tech. I know Shane Beamer shot those down the other day, but those rumors continue to roil on the back end. And if South Carolina was to come open, that's a really natural fit for James Franklin geographically and resource-wise, in my opinion, as well. So like if I'm in Arkansas, I'm calling James Franklin. If I'm UCLA, I'm calling to see if he's interested. UCLA has a really tough job. So is Arkansas, to be frank. But I think all of these places would benefit from at least checking. And I think he'll be a popular guy. And I still haven't seen his contract, but it does seem like he has some sort of duty to mitigate clause. So he's certainly going to be encouraged to work right away.
Yeah. I just knowing James here for the last 9 years, seeing how he handled that ESPN appearance again, don't think he's going to be drinking an umbrella drink on a beach for the next year. I think he wants to get back at it and prove what he's got. So we'll see. But Chris, appreciate it. I hope everyone's following your coverage in the 247 Sports universe and also with the CBS Sports Network and all over the place, whether it's videos, your writing. Really appreciate you have your finger on the pulse of this entire process as well as anybody. And you're always good to check into during these coaching searches for me as well. So thanks for being a good resource for us and a good conversation for us here on the podcast, man.
Yeah, man. Same to you. I always enjoy checking in with you on stuff and appreciate you having me on. Sorry for rambling so much, guys. I appreciate your time.
We ramble all the time on this podcast. It's welcome. So appreciate you, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Big thanks to Chris Hummer for joining us to talk about the coaching carousel, James Franklin, the post-James Franklin realities here for the Nittany Lions. A lot to digest, and we'll continue to do that over at Lions247.com. Join us for 60% off VIP until Tuesday at midnight. If that gets extended, check it out. Join us on Wednesday or Thursday. But as far as I know, we have a Tuesday midnight deadline for that 60% off. Hop in, get the latest on the coaching search from our staff, from our board insiders, and join the conversation. Don't be afraid to do that. Everyone's welcome. We'll talk to you soon. Next time around, we'll give you our feedback from the Penn State practice field. We'll let you know what we heard from interim head coach Terry Smith, what we heard from offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki, and a lot more coming your way with Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen joining me for episode 2 of this bye week on Thursday. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.